The road had long since abandoned pavement, trading it for gravel, and then again for winding dirt that whispered under each step like a secret. Nora had walked for hours now, though time seemed to bend in strange ways the moment she passed the crooked signpost at the forest's edge, the one etched with the words, "No destination required," half covered in ivy as though it hadn't been read in decades. She didn't know why her feet carried her this far, not really, only that something inside her, a tired rhythm, a quiet ache, was begging to slow down. The trees leaned in like old storytellers, their branches trailing ribbons of golden leaves in the low afternoon light, and the deeper she went, the more the sounds of the modern world seemed to dissolve into the hush of birdsong, rustling leaves, and the gentle trickle of some far-off stream. She clutched the strap of her satchel like it was a tether to the real world, but even that began to feel less necessary the moment the rooftops of the village came into view, rooftops not of slate or shingle, but moss and wildflowers, curling naturally into the hills as if they had grown there rather than been built. Smoke rose lazily from crooked chimneys, windows glowed with amber light, and in the center of it all stood a clock tower that looked like it had long since given up telling time. It was leaning slightly, its hands frozen at a minute past midnight, and its bell, once proud, now hung tilted with age and rust. A curious peace settled over her as she entered the cobbled square, where a handful of villagers moved without rush, their steps graceful, deliberate, as if each movement mattered. An old man swept fallen leaves into a perfect spiral. A child with silver hair and no shoes painted patterns on the stones with water and laughed when they disappeared. No one looked up at her in surprise, nor did they speak a welcome. They simply nodded as if they had expected her, always had. And there it was, the shop. It stood at the very edge of the square, next to a garden blooming impossibly with chamomile, lavender, and tiny glowing bulbs she couldn't name. The sign above the door read, "Timekeeper's Tea," and though it looked like it had been hand-painted by a distracted philosopher, it shimmered faintly in the light, like dew under moonlight. Nora hesitated. Something about that name stirred a vague warmth in her chest, like remembering the lyrics to a song you'd only ever heard in a dream. She pushed open the door, and a bell that sounded more like a wind chime announced her entry, not urgent, not loud, just present. Inside it smelled like warmth itself. Spices and herbs, dried fruit and polished wood, honey and something ancient she couldn't name. The space was small but endless somehow, like it folded in on itself, the walls lined with mismatched clocks, none of them ticking, all of them paused, their hands pointing in different directions as though refusing to agree on when they were. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver-threaded hair wrapped in a violet scarf, eyes like still water, and a smile that knew more than it said. "I've been waiting," she said simply, with a voice like parchment and perfume, and Nora found herself smiling without knowing why. "I don't know what I'm looking for," Nora admitted, because that was the only thing she truly knew for certain. "That's all right," the woman replied, already turning toward a shelf behind her filled with jars labeled things like memory dust, and starlight crumbs, and yesterday's breath. "Most people don't, not when they first arrive." She scooped a handful of something golden into a teapot shaped like a crescent moon and poured hot water over it from a kettle that hummed as if it remembered lullabies. The scent that rose up was at once familiar and foreign. It smelled like rainy Sundays, like warm blankets, like stories whispered in the dark. The woman poured the tea into 2 cups and motioned to a table by the window where the sun painted lazy streaks across the wooden floor. "What is this place?" Nora asked, finally sitting down, unsure whether she meant the shop or the village or the quiet in her chest that hadn't been there before. The timekeeper, Nora could think of no other name, sipped her tea with reverence and exhaled softly before answering. "This is where time comes to rest," she said, and the words didn't make sense in Nora's mind, but her heart nodded as if it had understood perfectly. People come here when the clocks inside them get too loud, or when they stop altogether. Nora looked out the window at the village, where even the breeze seemed to move at half speed, and she felt a strange sort of release, like an invisible thread pulled from her shoulders. "How did I find it?" she asked, and the timekeeper smiled again. "You listened," she said simply. "Most people don't." They sat in silence then, and it was not awkward nor uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that filled rather than emptied, that soothed rather than smothered. The tea was warm and slightly sweet, with a bitter note at the end that reminded Nora of farewells and forgiveness, and she drank slowly, deliberately, like it was something sacred. She didn't ask for a second cup, but the timekeeper poured one anyway, and the moment it touched her lips, Nora felt as though she had exhaled a lifetime of noise. She felt the slow untangling of thoughts knotted too tightly, the quiet settling of emotions like snowflakes on old stone. And then the strangest thing happened. She cried. Not loudly, not with pain, but with an ache so soft it felt like rain on warm skin. The timekeeper said nothing, simply placed a small, worn hand over hers, and they sat like that for a while, hands touching across time and space and stories. "What do I do now?" Nora asked finally, voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked at her with eyes that twinkled like candlelight in mirrors and said, "You don't have to do anything right now. That's the magic of this place. Just drink your tea, let time be tired for a while." Nora looked at the clocks on the walls, none of them moving, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to check her watch, or count the minutes, or make a plan. She closed her eyes and let herself drift, not to sleep, but to stillness. Not to forgetting, but to remembering what it meant to pause. And in that tiny tea shop, in a village that didn't care for maps or hours, Nora began to feel the possibility that perhaps time was not something to chase, nor fear, nor fill, but something to sip, like warm tea, with both hands wrapped around it and nowhere else to be. The morning, or what might have been morning, unfolded in a soft, golden hush, though there were no clocks to confirm it, no alarms or bells or digital beeps to signal its arrival. Nora awoke not in a bed, but on a thick patch of moss beside a sunlit window in the back room of the tea house, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, old pages, and something inexplicably warm, like a memory you didn't know you had. She blinked slowly, unsure of how she'd gotten there, yet feeling no urgency to question it, because her body felt light for the first time in what felt like years, light and still and entirely hers. A bird sang somewhere beyond the window, and a breeze stirred the curtain, carrying with it the scent of cinnamon bark and freshly sliced pear. She rose slowly, feeling the wooden floor beneath her bare feet like a grounding rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Each step a return to herself. When she stepped into the main room of the shop, the timekeeper was already there, humming an old tune as she arranged mismatched teacups on a round tray made of moonstone and iron. "Did you rest well?" the woman asked, not with politeness, but with a deep, sincere hopefulness that caught Nora off guard. "I think I did," Nora answered, then surprised herself by adding, "I don't think I've ever rested like that before." The timekeeper smiled with a kind of quiet pride, like someone who had been tending a very long garden and had just seen the first blossom of spring. "Most people confuse sleep with stillness," she said, handing Nora a cup filled with a tea the color of peach sunlight. "But stillness is a language, and when you stop talking over it, you start to understand things." Nora sipped the tea and felt warmth unfurl through her chest like a sigh she didn't know she was holding, sweet, earthy, tinged with something that tasted like kindness. They didn't speak for a while, and the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt full, brimming with the kind of peace that only appears when nothing is demanded of you. After some time, Nora asked, "Why do you call yourself the timekeeper, if the clocks here don't move?" The woman laughed, a soft, rolling sound like wind over a meadow. "Because I keep what time leaves behind," she said, gesturing to the shelves that lined the walls, where not just jars and teapots sat, but strange little items. A child's broken watch, a wilted corsage, a half-burnt letter, a glass marble filled with tiny stars. Every second someone throws away, every moment someone rushes through, I gather them, like loose threads, like forgotten songs. Time doesn't vanish when we ignore it, it just goes somewhere else. Nora stared at the objects and felt something shift inside her, a slow unraveling of the frantic need to do and achieve and conquer every minute. "I've wasted so much," she whispered, and her voice cracked with the weight of it. "I've rushed through entire years, trying to get somewhere I couldn't even name." The timekeeper set down her cup and looked at her with a gaze so steady it was like being held. "Nothing is wasted if it brought you here," she said softly, but with a certainty that rooted itself deep in Nora's ribs. "Even your rush was a kind of compass. It just pointed you here, to the pause between all that noise." Nora felt her throat tighten, not with sadness, but with the strange relief of being understood without having to explain herself. She looked around again, and suddenly the shop felt like more than just a place. It felt like a pocket stitched into the lining of the universe, hidden from the ticking world, a sacred space where things didn't have to make sense to be real. "Can I stay?" she asked, and even as she said it, she wasn't sure what she meant. Stay for the morning, the day, forever? But the timekeeper didn't ask for clarity, didn't demand definition. "Stay as long as time allows," she said, and though it should have been cryptic, it felt like an embrace. The next hours, or maybe it was days, the sun seemed to drift in its own direction here. Nora spent exploring the village beyond the tea shop. Each house was different, some small and round like teapots, others narrow and tall like chimneys, and one that was entirely made of vines and feathers, its roof alive with hummingbirds. The villagers were kind but quiet, never in a hurry, and they seemed to have no need for introductions. Every glance was familiar, every smile an acknowledgement of shared silence. One elderly woman sat in a rocking chair surrounded by clocks that she painted with melted moonlight. A man with a beard of smoke wrote poems in the air with a feathered pen, the words hanging above him like fireflies. Nora wandered the stone paths, letting her thoughts stretch out and breathe for the first time in what felt like her whole adult life. She didn't need to check her phone. It had long since stopped glowing, or worry about her inbox or the news or whether she was making progress. Here, progress was measured in heartbeats and tea leaves, in the slow turning of the wind, in the way your breath came a little easier each day. One evening, as the stars began to bloom in the sky like shy wildflowers, the timekeeper invited Nora to the back garden, where an old stone sundial sat surrounded by blooming moonflowers. "This is the hour between," she said, handing Nora a cup filled with a pale blue tea that shimmered faintly. "It's the time that isn't counted, between one day ending and another beginning. It's the breath the world takes when no one is looking." Nora sat beside her, feeling the night press gently against her skin, and for the first time, she understood what it meant to exist without effort. No striving, no proving, just being. She drank the tea slowly, and with each sip, memories she'd buried under calendars and deadlines began to surface, dancing barefoot in the rain at 17. Her father humming while he made pancakes. A letter she never sent. Regret mingled with sweetness, and it didn't hurt. It simply was. The timekeeper placed a hand over Nora's and said, "Most people think time is cruel, but that's only because they don't let it rest. You can't run with something that's meant to flow." Nora let the words settle inside her like seeds, and somewhere deep in her chest, something bloomed, soft, slow, and immeasurably alive. The stars whispered above them, the moonflowers swayed, and for a long, perfect while, time curled up like a cat in her lap, purring gently, asking nothing more than to exist. Nora woke one morning, or perhaps it was evening. The light was always golden here, unpinned from time's straight lines, to find a folded note tucked under her teacup, written in delicate ink that shimmered like dew. "Follow the sound of what you miss." She held the paper in both hands, as if it might melt from the warmth of her fingertips, and the moment she stepped outside the tea house, she heard it, a faint, haunting melody, like the sound of a music box half remembered from childhood, the tune dancing just at the edge of recognition. With no need to ask permission and no sense of urgency, she followed it through narrow alleys lined with overgrown ivy, past doors that opened for birds and windows filled with floating feathers, until she reached a wooden gate etched with countless tiny names, names that felt familiar even though she didn't know a single one. The gate creaked open on its own, and beyond it was a grove of crooked trees whose trunks bent like question marks, branches heavy with glimmering watches hanging like strange fruit, each one frozen, each one silent. She stepped into the grove, and the sound grew louder, not just the melody now, but soft ticking, like a room full of beating hearts slowed to a lullaby. There was someone standing in the center, a child, maybe 10 years old, wearing a robe made of patchwork fabric and holding a glass jar full of dust and starlight. The child turned and smiled as if they'd been expecting her forever. "This is where the seconds go when you lose them," the child said cheerfully, gesturing around the grove. "You know, the ones you waste, the ones you rush past, the ones you wish you had back. They come here to rest." Nora's breath caught in her throat. Something about the trees, the watches, the stillness of the air, it all felt achingly beautiful, and also unbearably sad. "Is that what I've done?" she whispered, not to the child but to the universe itself. "Thrown away too many seconds?" The child only shrugged and said, "Everyone does. But here, even those seconds get a second chance." They handed her the jar and added, "Breathe on it." Nora held it close and exhaled gently, and to her amazement, the dust inside began to swirl and glow brighter, forming little images like flickering dreams. Her mother brushing her hair beside the window. A birthday cake lit with too many candles and not enough wishes. A train ride where she watched the world blur by without ever looking up from her phone. The tears welled without warning, hot, soft, healing tears, not of regret exactly, but of recognition. "Can I take it back?" she asked, her voice fragile as a spider's thread. The child looked at her kindly. "No, but you can take it with you. You can remember what it meant to you. That's how lost time becomes part of your story instead of your shame." And with that, they vanished into the trees as if they had never been, and Nora was left alone in the grove, holding a jar of her own forgotten moments, the weight of it oddly comforting, like carrying the pieces of a puzzle she finally understood how to finish. She walked back to the tea shop under a sky that seemed to flicker between twilight and dawn, her steps no longer hurried, but deliberate and grateful. The timekeeper was waiting for her at the door, her hands covered in flour and her cheeks rosy from baking something that smelled like vanilla and toasted dreams. "You went to the Grove of Forgotten Seconds," she said with a knowing smile, as if it were no big thing, as if it were a place everyone passed through eventually. "Did you find what you were missing?" Nora held out the jar, still glowing faintly, and nodded. "I think I found parts of myself I didn't know I'd lost." The timekeeper placed the jar gently on the windowsill beside a row of others, some dim, some bright, each one a museum of a person's vanished hours, and said, "Then you're learning to keep time, too." That night, they had cake made with moon sugar and dreamberries, and sipped a tea that tasted like lullabies and honest words spoken at just the right time. They sat on the roof, wrapped in soft blankets, and watched the stars shift like curious eyes, and Nora felt the ache in her chest, the one that had lived there for years, disguised as stress or ambition or loneliness, begin to loosen. "Why don't more people come here?" she asked, staring into the sky as if it might answer. The timekeeper's voice was calm, but sad at the edges, because most people think slowing down means falling behind. They don't understand that sometimes, being still is the bravest thing you can do. Nora let those words settle, deep and wide, and thought about how long she had spent running, toward titles, toward perfection, toward a version of herself that always seemed to be just one step out of reach. But here, under the sky, beside the woman who brewed time into something you could drink, she realized she didn't have to chase it anymore. She could meet it, gently, in moments like this. She fell asleep on the rooftop, the stars blinking overhead like sleepy eyes, and for once, her dreams didn't rush. They lingered, they wandered, they hummed. She dreamed of a clock whose hands spun like petals in the wind, of paths made of seconds stitched into velvet, of a younger version of herself blowing bubbles in the rain and waving to her across time. When she woke, it was not because an alarm demanded it or a schedule insisted. She woke because she was ready. And as she sat up, the timekeeper was already there, holding 2 steaming cups and saying, "Today is the day you ask the question you've been afraid to ask." Nora didn't know what the question was yet, but she believed it would arrive, not like a bang or a bell, but like a teacup placed gently on a table, waiting to be noticed. It began in the silence between 2 sips of tea. The question, soft as a sigh, barely formed but insistent, like a feather brushing against the inside of her thoughts. Nora sat in her usual seat by the wide-paned window, her fingers curled around the mug of steaming amber liquid the timekeeper had brewed that morning. A blend she called the Quiet Truth, steeped with rosemary, clove, and petals that only bloomed in the hour before dawn. Outside, the sky was the color of soft ash and lavender, with the kind of light that didn't cast shadows but softened them. Inside, the tea shop breathed like a living thing. Warmth pulsing in the old wood, steam rising like gentle spirits, clocks frozen in moments that felt holy rather than broken. And somewhere in that delicate stillness, the question arrived, not with urgency, but with inevitability. Why was I always afraid of being still? Nora whispered, not really intending to speak aloud, but the words spilled from her like water breaking free of a dam too long held shut. The timekeeper didn't flinch, didn't stir, simply lifted her eyes from a basket of drying time and met Nora's gaze with that same deep, unwavering gentleness she always carried, like someone who had long ago made peace with all the questions the world could ask. Because being still means meeting yourself, she said, and the words hit Nora like a soft thunder. A part of her wanted to laugh, to deflect, to argue that she knew herself, her name, her job, her resume, her likes and dislikes. But the moment she tried to pull up those definitions, they fell away like paper masks in the rain, flimsy and soaked with all the effort she had poured into becoming someone acceptable, someone measurable, someone in control. And what if you meet a version of yourself you don't like? She asked, the question bitter on her tongue like oversteeped tea. The timekeeper smiled, not a placating smile, but a knowing one, the kind that said she had once wrestled with the very same question. Then you sit with her anyway, she said softly. You ask her what she's afraid of, and you don't get up until she answers. Nora felt a tremor ripple through her, not fear exactly, but the kind of vulnerability that arrives right before a revelation, that strange shaking you feel when you stand at the edge of truth and wonder if you're brave enough to fall into it. But I've built so much on that fear, she murmured. I've made a life out of running, proving, pushing forward. The timekeeper leaned forward, her fingers wrapped around her own mug, steam curling between them like incense, and said, and yet none of that brought you here. Your fear didn't lead you to this teacup, you did. The part of you that's tired of running, the part that's ready to listen. Nora closed her eyes, breathing in the fragrant steam, and for the first time in years, she asked herself not what came next, but what was already here. The quiet swelled like a wave, and from its depths rose memories, not just of stress and deadlines and empty successes, but of quiet rebellions, moments when she almost chose rest, almost said no, almost listened to her aching body when it asked for gentleness. She remembered standing in a stairwell during an office party, staring out at the night sky and wanting to disappear, not forever, but just long enough to remember who she was without the weight of everyone else's expectations. She remembered the dream she used to have as a girl of owning a bookstore by the sea, where people came not for the books, but for the hush between the pages. She remembered lying on the floor once at age 25, listening to an old record play the same crackling love song over and over, and thinking, maybe I don't want the life I'm building. These were not regrets. No, the timekeeper had taught her better than that. These were breadcrumbs, pieces of herself scattered along the path she hadn't taken but could still find her way back to. So what do I do with the life I have now? She asked, and this time her voice didn't shake. It carried curiosity instead of despair. The timekeeper sipped her tea, her eyes watching the way the light danced through the window, and said, you can change everything, or you can change nothing. Just don't go back to sleep inside yourself. Nora let the words wrap around her like a shawl, warm and necessary, and knew then that change didn't always have to be seismic. It could be small, tender, the quiet decision to breathe deeper, to say no with kindness, to write again, to walk without headphones, to stop performing her life and start living it. That afternoon, as the clouds rolled in and the first raindrops began to patter softly against the glass, the timekeeper brought out an old notebook, its cover faded blue, its pages uneven and yellowed, and handed it to Nora without explanation. It's time you started keeping your own time, she said with a wink. Inside the book were only questions, no answers, no instructions, just gentle invitations written in curling script. What moment today made you feel most like yourself? Where does your breath catch and why? If your life had a scent today, what would it be? Nora ran her fingers over the pages, the ink smudged in places where tears or tea had once landed, and she realized that the Timekeeper wasn't offering her magic or answers. She was offering her attention. The sacred practice of noticing, of being here, of treating her life like something worth sipping slowly. And that night, when the stars bloomed bright and wild above the village, Nora lit a single candle in her room, opened to a blank page, and wrote, "Today I met a version of myself I hadn't seen in a long time." She was quiet. She was tired. But she stayed. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether she'd stay here in the village or return to her old life. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't frighten her. It thrilled her, because now she knew how to sit still and ask, "What am I missing?" And then, most importantly, listen for the answer. It was the sound of laughter, soft, tired laughter, like wind chimes remembering a joke from long ago, that led Nora into the garden that evening, where the Timekeeper was kneeling in the dark soil beneath a crooked pear tree, her hands dusted with earth and her scarf slipped slightly off one shoulder. Fireflies blinked lazily around her like glowing punctuation marks in a sentence too beautiful to end, and above them the sky stretched wide and silent, its constellations hanging like question marks and lullabies. "You're always working," Nora said with a gentle smile, approaching slowly, not wanting to disturb the sacred rhythm of her presence. The Timekeeper looked up, a small grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I'm not working," she said, "I'm welcoming. The roots talk more freely at dusk." And Nora couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity and sweetness of it, because in this place, even the soil had something to say if you were quiet enough to listen. "Can I ask you something you've never told me?" Nora said, kneeling beside her and tucking her skirt under her knees, hands resting in her lap like unopened letters. The Timekeeper paused, brushing a curl of silver-streaked hair from her forehead, and her eyes shimmered, not with alarm, but with that same timeless knowing. "You already know you can," she answered. Nora looked down at her fingers, tracing little circles in the dirt, and then, in a voice that felt more like a wish than a question, she asked, "What's your real name?" There was a stillness then, deeper than silence, deeper even than sleep, the kind of stillness that only happens in places that exist outside of time's rules. The Timekeeper leaned back slightly, resting on her hands, and tilted her face toward the stars as if asking their permission. "It's been so long since anyone asked," she whispered, and Nora heard the weight in her voice, like a stone smoothed by years of being carried. "I gave it up a long time ago. Names have power, and when I took this role, I needed to set mine aside to hold space for others." Nora felt her breath catch. "But you had one once?" The woman nodded, and her smile was the kind that held both sorrow and sweetness. "I did. My name was Elia. It means sunlight, though I used to think it didn't fit me." Nora let the name roll through her mind like music, like poetry half remembered. "It does," she said simply, and Elia laughed, really laughed, full and alive and unguarded, and the sound of it wrapped around the garden like warmth spilling from an open window. "I suppose it does now," she said, her voice quieter but brighter somehow. "But there was a time I lived only in shadows. I rushed through life like everyone else, faster, faster, more, until I burned out so completely I thought I'd never feel whole again." Nora's heart tightened, and she leaned in, drawn to the honesty in Elia's tone like a tide pulled by the moon. "What happened?" she asked, voice barely a breath. Elia began to gather herbs into a basket, lemongrass, valerian, night mint. As she spoke, each motion careful, ceremonial. "I collapsed in the middle of a meeting," she said, her words both casual and devastating. "My body simply gave out. It wasn't a tragedy, not exactly, it was the most honest thing I'd done in years. And when I woke up, I was alone, in a tiny hospital room with a window overlooking a tree that had begun to bloom despite the snow. I stared at that tree for 3 days and 3 nights, and somewhere in that quiet, I made a promise to myself, I would no longer serve the clock that starved me." Nora's eyes brimmed with tears, and she reached for Elia's hand, grasping it gently, reverently, like it was the thread that tied her to something real again. "And you came here?" she asked. "No," Elia replied, her eyes twinkling. "The place came to me. One morning, I woke up, followed the scent of wild chamomile, and walked through a door that hadn't existed the day before, and I never left. Nora laughed through her tears, because of course that's how it happened. This village, this timeless corner of the world, had chosen her. Elia's voice softened as she brushed her thumb over a sprig of thyme. But I don't tell many people that. Most don't ask. They come here to forget, to pause, to breathe, but not to know. But you, she turned to look Nora fully in the eyes now, you came here to wake up. Nora felt something crack wide open in her chest, and it wasn't pain. It was truth, finally free of its cage. I think I was afraid to want anything too deeply, she said, blinking back emotion. Because if I wanted it, I could lose it, or worse, fail at it. Elia nodded. That's the lie time sells us, that if we move fast enough, we'll outrun our fear. But you and I both know, fear isn't a beast to outrun, it's a child to hold. Nora felt herself shiver, not from cold, but from recognition, from the deep, echoing yes that filled every corner of her being in that moment. She had spent years building walls of productivity around her heart, mistaking accomplishment for connection, efficiency for identity, noise for love. And here, in a garden lit only by stars and fireflies and the soft hum of truth, she let that illusion go. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words felt too small, too simple, but Elia shook her head gently. "Don't thank me, Nora. Just use the stillness you found. Don't make it a vacation, make it a way of being." They sat together in the quiet for a long time, no longer mentor and seeker, no longer guest and host. Just two women who had walked away from the edge of forgetting, sharing tea, tears, and the truth that none of us are broken, just tired of pretending not to be whole. When Nora finally returned to her room, the candle was already lit, the journal already opened, and on the first blank page were 5 words written in familiar ink. "Your name still belongs here." She smiled, softly, slowly, like the sun rising behind a mountain, and wrote, "My name is Nora. I am still becoming. I am not lost, I'm arriving." The morning arrived not with trumpets or clarity, but with a hush that seemed to hum beneath the floorboards. A stillness so deep it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing just long enough to see if Nora would notice. She sat up in bed slowly, the quilt falling from her shoulders like the past slipping quietly to the floor, and the soft golden light that filtered through the window was different today. Warmer, yes, but also expectant. Something had shifted, though she couldn't name it, couldn't touch it, only feel its pull like gravity turned sideways. On the table by her bedside was a tiny brass key wrapped in twine, and beside it, a note in Elia's familiar looping hand, "When you're ready, the door will find you." Nora's breath caught in her throat, not out of fear but recognition. That quiet, aching moment when you realize a part of your journey is coming to an end and something new, something terrifyingly free, is beginning to stir. She held the key in her hand, turning it over, its weight light but full of promise, and the metal felt warm, as if it remembered the hands it had passed through before hers. She dressed slowly, carefully, as if every movement was a ritual, brushing her hair not to tame it but to greet it, sliding into her softest sweater not for comfort but for honoring the skin she now lived in with love instead of impatience. When she stepped into the main room of the tea shop, Elia was already there, of course, sipping something that smelled like honeysuckle and memory, and for once she didn't speak right away. She just looked at Nora and smiled in that way only someone who's seen you crack and bloom can smile. "You felt it, didn't you?" Elia finally said, setting her cup down with the gentlest of clinks. "The shift." Nora nodded, the key pressed against her palm like a pulse. "I think the door is calling me," she said, and though her voice trembled slightly, it was not with hesitation, but awe. Elia didn't ask if she was sure, she never did. She simply stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to a shelf behind the counter where jars and bundles of dried thyme hung like sleepy whispers. She pulled down one small pouch, handed it to Nora, and said, "For the road, not to keep you safe, but to remind you that you already are." Nora tucked the pouch into her coat pocket and asked, "Where will it take me?" And Elia only shrugged with a smile too wide to be simple. "Where you need to go. Not where you think you need to go. There's a difference." And with that, she stepped back, letting silence wrap around them one final time. Not goodbye, not quite, but a pause between breaths. Nora stepped outside, the air bright and rich with the scent of distant sea and pine and something older than language, and she didn't have to look for the door. It was already there. Just beyond the garden, between two trees that had never been close enough to touch before, now stood a wooden doorframe hovering in the air, freestanding, as if built by wind and story instead of hammer and nail. It had no hinges, no knob, only a keyhole that pulsed faintly with light like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. Nora didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, slid the key into the lock, and turned it with a soft click that sounded somehow like her own name whispered in welcome. The door didn't swing open. It dissolved, like mist kissed by sunlight, revealing not a destination but a feeling. She stepped through, not knowing if it would be forest or city or memory or sky, and found herself in a place that was all of those things and none of them. It was quiet, not in the absence of sound kind of way, but in the everything is watching gently kind of way. The air shimmered faintly, and the path before her was made not of stone or dirt but tiny clock faces, each one ticking softly beneath her feet, measuring not time as the world knew it, but attention. Every step she took lit up with a memory. Here, a laughter shared on a subway at midnight. There, the feeling of sunlight on her hands the first time she wrote something she truly loved. She kept walking, slowly, reverently, until the path led her to a large mirror standing alone in a clearing, tall, arched, and framed in ivy and copper. In its surface, Nora saw not just herself but all the versions of her. The child who scribbled stories in the margins of her homework. The teenager who laughed too loudly to be liked. The woman who gave up her paintings because she was told they wouldn't pay rent. And behind them all, the version who had walked into the tea shop with a heart so heavy it almost couldn't lift a cup. Nora reached out and placed her hand on the glass, and as she did, the mirror shimmered and rippled like water, then showed her something she had not expected, herself in the future. Not a perfect, polished future, but a real one. She saw herself laughing with messy hair at a table surrounded by art and books and wildflowers in chipped mugs. She saw herself resting without apology, crying without shame, creating without permission. She saw herself alone but not lonely, connected not by roles or expectations but by presence, deep and abiding and soft. And she realized then, this door, this journey, this place, it wasn't leading her away from her life, it was leading her back into it, but with eyes that could finally see. Tears fell freely then, not from sadness, but from returning. She stepped away from the mirror, and behind her, a new door had appeared, this one plain, wooden, imperfect, painted in fading blue with scratches at the edges and a handle that looked well-worn from years of use. It was, somehow, her door, not magical, not hidden, but waiting for her in the world she had left behind. She took a deep breath, reached for the handle and whispered, "I'll keep time now. Not chase it." And as she turned the knob and stepped through, she felt not like she was leaving something behind, but bringing it with her. The stillness, the mirror, Elia, herself, all of it, carried gently in her bones like stardust and story. And somewhere, in the garden behind a crooked tea shop tucked between worlds, Elia smiled, poured another cup of tea, and whispered to the wind, "She made it." And the clocks, though frozen, throbbed with quiet joy. The air was thicker than she remembered when Nora stepped through the door and into the world she had left behind, the world of noise and rush and constant movement, where every moment was either an opportunity or a deadline, and everything seemed to demand a piece of her. Yet, as she walked down the familiar streets of her city, she felt something different in the air around her. It was almost like stepping into the same river after a long absence. Everything looked the same, but she could feel the subtle currents had changed, that the water moved in a new way now, because she had learned how to swim without fighting against it. She didn't rush. She didn't look at her watch. She didn't check her phone, even when it buzzed in her pocket, demanding her attention like a child tugging at her sleeve. No, she simply listened, to the sound of her own footsteps, to the laughter of children playing in the park, to the soft hum of a street musician playing an old song on a weathered violin. She let the moments wash over her without the need to fill them with productivity or expectation. Elia's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to chase time. Time will always be there, waiting for you to notice it, waiting for you to choose it. So Nora did just that. She chose time. She chose to linger. She chose to be present. She stepped into a cafe she'd passed 100 times but had never entered, its windows fogged from the inside with warmth, its scent of fresh coffee inviting her like a secret shared between strangers. The barista smiled at her, an older man with silvering hair and laughter lines around his eyes, and she ordered her tea, just as she had in the tea shop, with a knowing smile. No need to rush. No need to plan. Just be. She sat at the window, watching the world pass by, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel behind it. She didn't feel apart from it. She felt a part of it, a moment in time, like the petals of a flower opening slowly to the sun. As she sipped her tea, she thought about what she would do now, what real change would look like in this world, outside of the tea shop, outside of the village where time stood still, outside of the magic that had so gently unraveled her. She thought about the book she'd wanted to write for years, the one that had always been pushed aside by deadlines and meetings and the pressure to do something useful. The book that had once felt like a distant dream, almost laughable, but now felt like the most honest thing she could offer the world. I'll write it, she whispered to herself, surprised by how easy it sounded, how right it felt. No more waiting. No more excuses. She would take the time, claim it like a gift, and spend it on something that mattered to her. She spent the next few days wandering the city with a newfound sense of purpose, no longer burdened by the need to achieve, but driven by a deeper sense of fulfillment. She made art again, drawing, painting, sketching the scenes around her that had once seemed mundane but were now alive with possibility. She wrote in her journal, filling page after page with thoughts, memories, observations, and dreams, her own words unfolding like the petals of a flower she'd forgotten how to tend. She visited old friends, called family members she hadn't spoken to in too long, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the silence between them. She let the pauses be as full as the words, and they found new ways of connecting, not out of obligation or routine, but out of presence. And then one evening, when the golden hour settled over the rooftops and painted the streets in honeyed light, Nora received a letter in the mail. It was simple, not much more than a folded page with a hand-drawn sketch of a teapot and the words, "You are the keeper of your own time now. Don't forget to savor it." No signature, no address. But Nora knew. She didn't need the return address to know it came from Elia, from the tea shop that had taught her the quietest, most powerful lesson of all, that to truly live, you have to be willing to be still. She read the letter twice, letting the message seep into her soul, and then she folded it carefully, tucking it into the journal that had become a lifeline. She smiled as she placed the journal on the shelf, beside her brushes and paints and half-filled notebooks, and felt a small, contented warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt complete, not because she had figured everything out, but because she had allowed herself to simply be. The world around her buzzed with its usual frantic pace, but Nora didn't mind. She no longer needed to control it or escape it. She had learned that time, like tea, could be savored slowly, moment by moment, sip by sip. And that was enough. It would always be enough. As the moon rose high in the sky that evening, Nora stood on her balcony, looking out at the city she had returned to, and for the first time in years, she felt like she had finally arrived, not in any particular place, but in herself. She whispered into the night, knowing that somewhere out there Elia was smiling, and that the tea shop, the garden, the door, and the key would always be waiting for her, quietly, gently, but never demanding. Just waiting, like time itself, patient and eternal. And Nora, with a heart full of light and a spirit unburdened, was ready to begin again. Not as someone who had escaped the world, but as someone who had finally learned to live in it, fully and completely, just as she was. The end, or perhaps, the beginning. Nora woke the next morning to a world that felt both entirely familiar and yet entirely new. The sunlight, which had once seemed harsh and demanding, now filtered through her window in soft golden beams, as though it too had been waiting for her to notice. She took a deep breath, her chest expanding as she embraced the newness, the stillness that had begun to settle into her bones. It was early, still too early for the world to be in full swing, but for once, Nora didn't rush. She simply let the quiet stretch out before her like a long, leisurely stretch of road, unhurried, open, full of promise. The city outside her window had never looked more beautiful, more inviting. For the first time, she could see the rhythm of it, the pulse that hummed beneath the daily chaos, the invisible thread that connected everyone and everything. A smile tugged at her lips. She didn't need to figure it out anymore. She just needed to follow it, step by step, moment by moment, as though life were nothing more than a dance, and she was learning its rhythm all over again. She stood, stretched, and then walked to the window. As she did, her fingers brushed against something odd on the windowsill, a small object, soft and warm, wrapped in a piece of cloth. She frowned, curiosity prickling at her skin. It wasn't there when she went to bed. She unwrapped it carefully, her breath catching in her throat when she saw what it was. It was a tiny, hand-carved wooden key, almost identical to the one she had used to open the door in the tea shop, the one that had led her into the village that was both of time and outside of it. Nora's heart beat faster, a thrill of recognition sparking within her. She stared at the key for a long time, wondering if she was dreaming, if perhaps she was imagining things. She felt no immediate urge to go back to the village. It had been a gift, a transformation, and it had changed her in ways she could not explain. But the key? The key was a reminder that there was still more to discover, more to feel, more to live. She held it gently in her palm, feeling the warmth of it, feeling the old, familiar pulse of magic within its carved wood. There was no note this time, no explanation, no invitation. Just the key, as though it were waiting for her to decide whether she was ready. Ready for what? She wasn't sure. But somehow, she knew that whatever it was, she wasn't alone. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down at it, noticing a message from an old friend, a woman named Leah who had once been her closest confidant in another life. A life before the tea shop, before the stillness. The message read, "I found something of yours today. Do you want to meet for tea? I think it might help you understand some things about where you've been." Nora's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard from Leah in months, and the words hung in the air between them like an unfinished sentence. What had Leah found? And why had she waited so long to reach out? She quickly typed back, "Yes, I'll meet you. When and where?" The response was immediate. "I'll be at the cafe on Oak Street at 2 p.m. Come alone if you can." A small chill ran through Nora, but she couldn't quite place why. There was something different in the tone of Leah's message, something serious, even urgent. A part of her hesitated, but only for a moment. She was no longer the same woman who had felt lost and out of control. She had the key now. She had time, or rather, she had learned how to truly live with it. And she was ready to face whatever waited for her. 2 hours later, Nora stood outside the cafe on Oak Street, the familiar little place where she and Leah had once spent countless afternoons drinking tea, exchanging stories, and sharing laughter. The door was ajar, and the scent of freshly baked pastries wafted out into the street, reminding Nora of simpler days, of the person she had been before all the changes. She entered the cafe, and her eyes immediately locked with Leah's, who was sitting at their usual table in the corner, the one by the window where the light always hit just right. Leah's face was drawn, her eyes wide with something Nora couldn't quite decipher, perhaps fear, perhaps anticipation. She looked as though she were waiting for someone, or something, to arrive. "Nora," Leah said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "You've been gone for so long. Where have you been?" Nora sat down across from her, her fingers brushing the warm cup of tea that had been set in front of her. "I've been finding my way," she said, the words tasting both foreign and true. She thought of the tea shop, of Elia, of the door, of the key, of the journey that had taken her so far away from the person she used to be, yet had also brought her back to herself. Leah studied her for a moment, her brow furrowing as though trying to decide how much to reveal. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I've been keeping something from you, Nora. Something I found while you were away." She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to overhear. Then, with trembling hands, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag and slid it across the table. It was an old map, one that looked ancient, worn at the edges, the ink faded in places. And in the center of the map was a circle, marked with a symbol Nora knew all too well. It was the symbol of the key, the very same one she had held in her hand this morning. "What is this?" Nora asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Leah said, her voice quivering. "But I think it's connected to you. And to the place you've been. The tea shop, the Timekeeper. I think it's all part of something bigger, something we don't understand." Nora looked down at the map, her heart pounding. She felt as though she were on the edge of a cliff, looking into a chasm that held not only the unknown, but the very thing she had been searching for. She didn't know how, but she knew now that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The key had found her again. And this time, she wouldn't be walking alone. Nora's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the symbol on the map, the faded ink beneath her touch seeming to pulse with an energy that was both familiar and unsettling. Leah watched her intently, her face clouded with something Nora couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or a deep, unspoken recognition. The teacup between them had gone cold, untouched since their arrival, and the ambient hum of the cafe seemed to fade into the background as Nora's world contracted into this singular, curious object, the map. "Do you know what this is?" Nora asked, her voice a mix of wonder and trepidation. Leah shook her head slowly, her fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater. "No, I didn't recognize it when I found it. But something about it felt like it was waiting for you. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't ignore it either. I thought I was losing my mind when I realized the map matched the symbol on the key you showed me before." Nora's heart raced as she glanced at the map again. The symbol, the same intricate, spiraling pattern that had appeared in the key she had found on her windowsill that morning, felt like a thread pulling her closer to some invisible center, something far greater than she could understand in that moment. But the pull was undeniable, the map a beacon calling her toward something she could neither avoid nor refuse. "What do you think it means?" Nora asked, her voice soft but steady, even as a quiet storm of thoughts and questions churned in her mind. Leah hesitated, then leaned closer. "I think it's leading us somewhere. Somewhere hidden. Somewhere that time as we know it doesn't exist. It's almost like the map itself is a map of possibilities, not places you can physically travel to, but experiences or places that could exist if you chose to step outside of the ordinary flow of life." The words felt like they were meant to be felt more than understood. Nora had spent so long searching for meaning in things that could be defined by logic, by understanding, by the tangible. But now, faced with the map, and with Leah's cryptic words, she felt the truth of what Leah was saying settle into her chest like a hidden spark. This wasn't just a map of locations. It was a map of decisions, of crossings and intersections in life that might never appear on a traditional map, but were crucial nonetheless. Paths that only opened up when you stopped looking for the path itself and instead trusted what lay within you. Nora's hand shook slightly as she placed the map on the table between them. "I need to go," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could fully comprehend them. The urgency that had been growing within her over the last few days now reached a boiling point. It wasn't a choice, not really. It felt like a calling, an invitation from something larger than her own fears or doubts. The map was alive with meaning, with power, and if she didn't step forward now, she feared it would disappear like a dream slipping away at the first light of day. Leah, though clearly shaken, nodded. "I know. But be careful, Nora. There's something about this, something that doesn't make sense. It's not just time that's being affected here. It's something deeper, something older." Nora didn't have time to question Leah's cryptic warning. There was a quiet sense of finality in the air, the kind that filled a room just before an unseen door creaks open into the unknown. She gathered her things, her purse, her coat, the map, and stood up. "I'll be careful, but I have to go. I think I was always meant to." Leah reached out, grabbing her arm gently. "Nora, please don't forget to come back." Nora smiled, squeezing Leah's hand in return. "I'll be back. but I can't stay anymore. Not in this life, not with the way things are. Not when there's something else waiting. And with that, she left the cafe, the chill of the outside air sweeping over her as she stepped onto the busy streets once more, but this time, everything felt different. Every person walking by, every car rushing past, seemed like part of a larger dance, an intricate web of lives that she could feel, but no longer needed to control. She felt like an outsider in her own city, as though she had just woken up to the realization that the city had always been alive with possibilities, and she was only just beginning to see them. The map led her out of the heart of the city, down roads she had never taken before, through streets where the buildings grew quieter and the sound of passing cars faded into the background. It was as if she was walking through layers of reality, peeling back the fabric of the world she had known and stepping into something timeless. She followed the map, her heart beating in sync with the rhythms of the world around her, until she came to an old bridge that spanned a small creek. The bridge itself was weathered, its wooden beams cracked and worn with age, but there was something about it that drew her in. The map, still in her hand, led her here, pointing to the bridge with a symbol next to it that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the late afternoon. Nora crossed the bridge without hesitation, the sound of her footsteps mingling with the gentle rush of the water below. When she reached the other side, she paused. The path ahead was no longer paved, but instead a dirt trail that wove between tall trees, their branches heavy with moss, and the air smelled like damp earth and old secrets. The map pointed forward, but there was something else now, something she could feel at the edges of her awareness, a soft pull from within her. It wasn't just the map that was guiding her anymore. It was something deeper, a kind of knowing that spoke to her from the core of her being, from the place where her heart beat with a rhythm that was both human and ancient. She stepped onto the path, feeling as though she were walking into a dream that was somehow already familiar. With every step, the world around her seemed to shift, not in a sudden jolt, but in a slow, deliberate dance. A dance that was both her own and someone else's. The deeper she walked into the forest, the less real it seemed, and the more she felt as though she were being transported to another time, another world altogether. She reached a clearing and there, in the middle of the quiet, stood a door. It was an old wooden door, weathered with age, standing alone in the middle of the forest as if it had always been there, waiting for her. The map had led her here, and now, the key was in her hand again, warm, pulsing with an energy that seemed to resonate with the forest itself. Without a second thought, Nora stepped forward, slid the key into the lock, and turned it. The door opened, and beyond it lay not just another world, but the world, the one where time was no longer a master, but a companion. The moment Nora turned the key, she felt the world shift, subtle at first, like the faintest vibration beneath her feet, and then more pronounced, like a gentle exhale that passed through the very air around her. The door creaked open, revealing a soft glow emanating from the other side, and for the briefest of moments, Nora wondered if she had made a mistake. What lay beyond was no longer the familiar world of cities and streets, clocks and calendars. No, this was something different. Something that whispered of forgotten stories and secrets yet to be told. She took a breath and stepped through. Immediately, the world around her seemed to dissolve into a space that wasn't quite here, and yet wasn't quite there either. She was standing on the edge of a vast, open meadow, but the grass beneath her feet shimmered as though the earth itself was alive with possibility, bending and twisting with every step she took. The sky overhead wasn't just blue, but layered with hues of purple, pink, and gold, as if the sun was setting and rising all at once, trapped in an eternal dance of twilight. In the distance, she could see towering mountains that seemed to pierce the sky, but as her gaze swept over them, they shimmered and wavered, as though they were not entirely bound by the laws of nature. The trees that dotted the meadow had silver leaves, their trunks twisting in impossibly intricate patterns, and their branches reached toward the sky like hands reaching out to touch the stars. Nora blinked, unsure whether her mind was playing tricks on her, but the vividness of this place was undeniable. She had entered a realm where time, it seemed, did not follow the rules she knew. She felt lighter here, as if the weight of her past was no longer holding her down, but floating freely, carried by the very air around her. She stood in the center of the meadow, surrounded by the surreal beauty of it all, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. In the distance, a figure approached. It was a woman, tall and graceful, dressed in flowing robes that shimmered with the same iridescent glow as the grass beneath Nora's feet. Her long hair moved as if stirred by a wind that wasn't there, and her eyes, when they met Nora's, sparkled with a knowing that made Nora's heart skip a beat. "You've come," the woman said, her voice soft, yet filled with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. "I knew you would." Nora swallowed, her mind racing to catch up with her heart. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite herself. "What is this place?" The woman smiled, a knowing, serene smile, as though she had been expecting this very question. "This is a place between times," she said. "A place where all things are possible, but none are certain. A place where choices unfold, like petals of a flower in bloom, and where every step leads you closer to who you are meant to be." Nora's eyes widened. She had heard the word choices before, had heard the implications of it many times in her life, but there was something in this woman's words that made her feel as though the word itself had new meaning here. "But I don't understand," she said, her voice rising in confusion. "I thought I was searching for something. A purpose. A path. How can I find it here, in a place like this?" The woman stepped closer, her feet barely making a sound as she walked on the shimmering grass. She reached out, gently cupping Nora's face in her hands, her touch warm but not quite solid. "The path you seek is not one that is given to you," she said softly. "It is the path you choose to create. The journey you embark upon, not because you are told to, but because you are ready to walk it." Nora's breath caught in her throat. Was this what she had been searching for all along? Was it really that simple? Had she truly spent all this time searching for answers outside herself, when everything she needed was here, inside her? A surge of realization washed over her, and she almost laughed at how much she had missed the obvious truth. The woman smiled as if reading her thoughts. "Do not rush, Nora. There is no need to know everything at once. You will find your way in your own time. Just remember, time is not something to control, but something to dance with, like the wind through the trees." Nora closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the pulse of the woman's words settle deep within her. When she opened them again, the meadow before her seemed to stretch endlessly, full of possibilities she hadn't yet seen. The mountains shimmered, inviting her to explore their hidden depths, while the path behind her, the one she had walked, seemed to fade into the distance, as if she had stepped into another world altogether. "I don't know if I'm ready," Nora admitted, her voice small in the vastness of this place. "How can I be ready for something like this?" The woman's eyes softened, and she gave a gentle nod. "You are ready because you have already taken the first step. All you must do now is listen, to the world around you, to the rhythms of your own heart, and to the quiet whisper of the winds that guide you forward. The journey will reveal itself, piece by piece, as you embrace each moment, each choice." Nora looked around, feeling the weight of the woman's words. She thought of the tea shop, of Elia's quiet wisdom, of the key, of the map, and of the feeling of being here in this place now. Every step had led her to this moment, each decision, each turning point, each quiet realization. With a deep breath, Nora nodded. "I think I understand." The woman smiled again, her eyes glimmering with approval. "Good. Now, you must decide. The path ahead is not one that can be chosen for you. It is yours alone to walk. Will you continue, or will you return?" Nora's heart skipped at the weight of the question. She could feel the pulse of this place in her bones, the unspoken promise of what awaited her if she chose to stay, to explore, to live fully in this realm where time wasn't a constraint, but a companion. She thought of Leah, of the life she had left behind in the city, of the responsibilities she still carried. And yet, something in her heart whispered that this was where she needed to be, that this journey was hers to walk. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to see where it leads." And with that, the world around her shifted once more, not in any grand, overwhelming way, but in the soft, subtle way that time itself flows when you are no longer fighting against it. The woman smiled one last time, and with a gesture, she beckoned Nora to follow her into the heart of the meadow, where the possibilities of the world waited to unfold. As Nora stepped forward, she no longer felt like a traveler in someone else's story. She felt like she was beginning to write her own. Nora's feet sank into the soft, glowing grass as she followed the woman deeper into the meadow. The air around her seemed to hum with the promise of something unspoken, as if the very earth was alive with secrets waiting to be discovered. The path before her wasn't marked by any clear signs. No banners, no arrows, no roadmaps, just an endless, winding stretch of possibility. And yet, somehow, she knew where to go. The woman, who had introduced herself only as the guide, walked beside Nora in silence, her movements fluid and graceful, as if she were not bound by the same laws of gravity that governed Nora's body. The sun, or what Nora assumed was the sun, shimmered overhead in shades of gold and lavender, casting an ethereal light on the landscape. Everything felt timeless. Not in a way that felt overwhelming, but in a way that made Nora realize that in this place, she could truly become whoever she wished. She wasn't constrained by the weight of expectations, by the tick-tock of clocks, or the rigid structure of days. Here, there was freedom, but with freedom came choices. The guide spoke at last, her voice soft but carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. Here, Nora, you are free to live without the pressure of time, without the fear of missing something. You can stay here, in this timeless place, and you will never age. You will never want for anything. But this world, like all worlds, is governed by one rule. Even in freedom, choices must be made. Each decision you make here will create a new thread, a new path. And with each step, you must decide which life you wish to lead. Which Nora will you become? Nora stopped walking, the weight of the decision settling over her like a cloak. She turned to face the guide, her eyes wide with a mix of wonder and uncertainty. I don't understand. Why must I choose? Why can't I just live? The guide's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on Nora's shoulder. You can live, Nora, but a life that isn't chosen isn't truly yours. You must choose your path, embrace who you are, in order to step into your full potential. In this place, you are the weaver of your own story. Time doesn't tell you where to go next, you do. And that is what makes your journey so precious. Nora's chest tightened as the weight of the decision pressed upon her. She thought of everything she had left behind. The city, her old life, Leah, the tea shop. She thought of the key, of the map, of the moments she had spent in the tea shop with the timekeeper, of the magic she had once felt pulsing through her. All those paths, all those choices, led her here. But now, standing at the edge of a new beginning, she realized that the only thing holding her back was herself. The guide gave her a small, understanding smile. The question isn't whether you are ready. The question is whether you are willing. Will you embrace the unknown, the uncertainty, and choose to walk your own path? Nora took a deep breath. She looked around, her eyes drinking in the beauty of this place, the vibrant colors, the boundless sky, and the ever-shifting landscape. She realized something in that moment. She had been afraid. Afraid of making the wrong choice. Afraid of leaving the safety of the known. But now, she understood that every path was uncertain. And yet, uncertainty wasn't something to be feared. It was an invitation to grow, to explore, to evolve. I'm ready, she whispered. I'm ready to choose. And in that moment, the world shifted. The meadow around her bloomed with life, the trees bending toward her as if in acknowledgement. The air shimmered with a soft, comforting energy, and for the first time, Nora felt completely at peace. The weight of every choice, every fear, every hesitation, slipped away like a cloud dissipating in the sun. She was ready. She was finally ready to live fully, to embrace the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. The guide smiled, her eyes twinkling. Then go, Nora. Live your story. Choose your path. Nora nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of excitement and peace. She took one last look at the meadow, at the shimmering mountains in the distance, and at the door she had passed through to get here. Then, with a deep breath, she took her first step forward. As she did, the world seemed to open up before her, each step unfolding a new chapter of her journey. She could feel the energy of time itself swirling around her, but this time, it didn't feel like a force pulling her along. Instead, it felt like a dance, her dance, guided by her own rhythm. She was no longer a passenger in her life. She was the one who held the pen, writing her story with every choice, every action. The path before her was no longer a mystery. It was hers to create. Years passed, though Nora could never quite pinpoint how many. In this world, time didn't measure itself by days or months, but by the experiences she embraced. She returned to the tea shop many times, walking through its familiar door as if she were coming home, each time finding a new lesson, a new revelation. Elia was always there, always waiting, a silent witness to her journey. Nora never truly left the world she had entered through the door. It remained with her, a part of her soul. She carried its quiet peace, its unhurried rhythm, into every aspect of her life. She no longer feared the ticking of clocks or the passing of time. She had learned to dance with it. As the Timekeeper had once told her, time was never something to be controlled, only something to be embraced. And with that, Nora found herself fully alive, fully present, and fully free to choose her own path in the dance of time.